This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
I'd like to welcome Ryan S. Walters to the show. Ryan is an independent historian and author of several books. Today, we are going to talk about Ryan's latest book, Disaster at NASA, a book about the Apollo 1 tragedy. Ryan is also the author of Grover Cleveland, the Last Jeffersonian President, which you said is coming out with the revised edition shortly.
Yeah, it's coming out within a day or two.
So we'll definitely, I love Grover Cleveland, so I would definitely like to talk about him some more. But today, let's get back to the issue at hand, the Apollo 1 disaster. Thank you so much for coming on the show. But before we get started, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got interested in the Apollo 1 disaster and situation?
Well, I'm a historian, and I teach history in Texas at Collin College, and I've really always just enjoyed history in general. I do political history mainly, but I've always been a space buff as well. At least the history of NASA and space, not from the standpoint of wanting to be an astronaut. I wouldn't qualify for that at all. Math and science, just not my thing, but I've always been interested in it, enjoyed it as being part of the Cold War, and of course the excitement of NASA. And I've always wanted to do a book on it. Most of my books are political in nature, and I thought about it with the renewed interest of NASA in the space program, because we just passed the 50th anniversary of the moon landing and those kind of important dates. So I said, I'd like to do something on the space program. And I was trying to figure something out. And it came to me one night that we really hadn't revisited the Apollo 1 tragedy. And my book, Apollo 1, The Tragedy That Put Us on the Moon, is about that. It's really NASA's first disaster. And it's important because without that tragedy, we would have made Kennedy's deadline to land on the moon by the end of 1969. And my position in the book is I don't think we would have made it at all. And I use about 200 and something pages to explain that.
Before we get too deep into the particulars of the Apollo 1, why, starting off just with the history of NASA, why was I guess for the lack of a better word, the Space Force or the space apparatus of the United States put under civilian control instead of military control?
Right. NASA is a civilian agency headed by a civilian. And it's really today, it's not in a specific department. It's actually under the White House. The vice president's actually nominally in charge of the space program. Of course, there's a military component to it. There always was. The original astronauts came from, they're all military test pilots and things like that. The head of the Apollo program at the time in Washington was an Air Force general named Sam Phillips. So there's military aspects of it. But you're right, it's a civilian agency, and they insisted on that when they created it. This is not a military, another branch of the military. This needs to be separate. Of course, now we got Space Force and all of that, so it's a little different. But in the original days, it was intended to be civilian. When it was created under Eisenhower, he was very emphatic. We don't need to have we don't want this to be militaristic. We want this to be seen as civilian and leaning towards science, gaining scientific knowledge from our space program. And part of that was not to antagonize the Soviets. We didn't want to get into a militaristic space race and militarize space. But of course, we ended up with a competition when Kennedy came along. But they worked hard to keep it non-military in nature.
What were the projects or missions that preceded the Apollo mission?
There were actually two programs, and not a lot is known about, particularly the middle one. Project Mercury was conceived in the late 50s. NASA was created in 1958. The first astronauts were selected in 1959, and they had already conceived, and this was during Eisenhower's presidency, they'd already conceived Project Mercury and Project Apollo. And that's all that was originally conceived. Project Mercury was very simple. Get a man in space, orbit the Earth, come back safely. That's the limit of it. And the spacecraft was very limited. That's really all it could do. It couldn't maneuver very much. It was essentially a man in space program. It was 6 missions. and very successful missions. The last one by Gordo Cooper in 1963 orbited the Earth 22 times, which was the record up until that time. But that was about the limit of that program. And of course, Apollo was to go to the moon, but they realized going to the moon is much more complex. It's not simply going out to the moon and coming back. There's a lot of skills that are necessary. So they conceived in 1961 a second program called Gemini. And that was to hone those skills, perfect those skills, spacewalking, long duration missions up to 14 days, rendezvous and docking. And there were 10 missions in about 20 months, very successful program. And that position to begin Project Apollo in 1967. That was the date to begin Apollo. The last Gemini was November of 1966, and they were set to fly the first Apollo in February of 1967. So they were working on Apollo the entire time that we were doing Mercury and Gemini. It's not like we had one program and we completed it and then we decided to do something else. Apollo, the contracts for Apollo were awarded in 1961. So that was all being done while we were perfecting skills in space.
Kennedy had done his famous speech where he said to put a man on the moon. Was the objective of NASA even before Kennedy to always go to the moon, or was it a more general space program and Kennedy's the one who set this big plan?
Well, yeah, Project Apollo to go to the moon was actually conceived under Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower did not really favor that. Eisenhower was very, very conservative, fiscally speaking. He thought it was a crazy idea to spend at the time an estimated $40 billion, which is, peanuts today. But in those days, $40 billion was a lot because the whole budget was about $100 billion. He said, we got to spend $40 billion to go to the moon. It's ridiculous. And a lot of scientists didn't support it either. Eisenhower's scientific advisor said, we can do a lot less and be a lot safer by unmanned probes and machines to do the same thing. But Kennedy saw it as a race against the Soviets. Remember, we're in the Cold War. You have to keep the space race and the moon race in the context of the Cold War. And we weren't doing too hot when Kennedy came around in 1961, and Kennedy realized this is something that we can use to beat the Soviets. And he's the one that set the goal to land on the moon by the end of the decade. So he really gave it a shot of steroids, if you will. And of course people say, well, he did that and it shocked everybody that he just went out and said this on his own. That's actually not true. I detail it in the book. He actually sat down with NASA days before that speech and he laid it out. He said, look, can we go to the moon and can we do it by the end of the decade? So he'd already talked to NASA's top people and they said, yeah, we can do it if we get the funding. So it was already, set behind the scenes before he went out and said that publicly.
Now, can you tell us a bit about Apollo 1 and especially the three crew members, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, maybe how they were selected and get into a little bit about just the whole process of that mission?
Sure. My book, Apollo 1, The Tragedy That Put Us on the Moon, again, it's about this would be the first manned Apollo mission. As I mentioned, Apollo was already conceived. They awarded the contracts in 1961. And the companies that were building the spacecraft and the components were working all through Mercury and Gemini to be ready. Because you have to do it all at the same time. You can't do one and then the other to meet Kennedy's deadlines. That deadline's always hanging out there. Hey, we got to do it by December of 1969 to honor the late president. So Apollo 1 was set to fly originally in the end of 1966, but there were a lot of problems with the spacecraft. This was the most sophisticated spacecraft or any machine that man had ever tried to come up with. I mean, you got to realize the command module itself had 30 miles of wire and hundreds of connectors, and they're very complex. Maybe not by today's standards, but at that time, it was. So they're putting this together, and there was all kind of problems. They selected the crew, and that was Gus Grissom. Gus Grissom was an original Mercury astronaut. He was the second American in space in 1961. He flew the first Gemini mission in 1965. He was a probably the best engineer of all of the astronaut corps. Just a phenomenal guy. So he's an original Mercury astronaut. The second guy in the crew, Ed White, he was the senior pilot. Ed White had come in with the second group of astronauts, 1962, and flew the second Gemini mission, Gemini 4. And he was the first American to walk in space in the summer of 1965. Really a great guy, an all-American guy. I did a lot of research on Ed White, and I could find nothing that anybody ever said bad about the guy. Everybody seemed to love him. The third member, Roger Chaffee, he was the rookie. He had not flown. He came in with the third group of astronauts. He had not been a military test pilot. They had dropped that credential for the third group. He was a recon pilot. He flew reconnaissance missions. As a matter of fact, he flew several missions over Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, taking some of the pictures that people have seen on television shows and things that Kennedy saw showing the missile. So he had done some pretty dangerous missions, but this would be his first space mission. So they were set to fly in what was pushed back to February 1967. And of course, the spacecraft was going through tests, unmanned and manned, a lot of problems. But the last crucial test was called a plugs out test. The spacecraft sitting on the booster, they don't fuel the boosters until they're ready to go. But it's sitting there under its own power. That's why it's called plugs out. It's not plugged into any external power sources. The crew's in their suits. There are helmets on, 100% oxygen pumped into the spacecraft, hatches shut, and they do a simulated launch countdown. And on January the 27th, 1967, they were doing the last major test before the flight, and something sparked in the spacecraft, and 100% oxygen under pressure with flammable materials caught fire. And the fire spread across the spacecraft pretty quickly and killed the crew within seconds.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Before we delve into a little bit of more about how this terrible tragedy started, what were the chances that Grissom, White, or Chaffee would have actually have gone to the moon had this been a successful mission? Would they have was there a rotation of astronauts, or were they sort of preening them to be the crew of the main lunar mission?
Yeah, they had a rotation that they put in, and Deke Slayton was an original Mercury astronaut. He didn't get to fly during Mercury or any other program until later because he had a heart problem, and he was put in charge of the crews, the chief astronaut, and then he was the chief of flight crew operations. So he's the one that actually picked and selected the crews. And of course, they put in a rotation where you would be on a backup mission, and then a few missions later, you would be on a prime mission. And the idea in NASA was we would like the first man on the moon to be an original Mercury astronaut. And Gus Grissom was slated to be the guy. If this had been successful and things had moved forward, I found several sources that said Gus Grissom was told privately, "We want you to take the first step on the moon." So that's likely would have happened. I actually think all three of them probably would have walked on the moon. I think Ed White certainly would have commanded an Apollo mission of his own later and walked on the moon. Roger Chaffee as well. They were really set to be, from all indications. I think it's a good bet that all of them would have probably walked on the moon.
Now this mission, the Apollo 1, it ended very badly, and as you said, the three crew members died. And you said that this wasn't an actual flight; it was just a test. What went wrong? I usually with this sort of thing, it's not one thing went wrong. Is this a situation where one thing went wrong, or was there a series of events that led to the disaster?
Yeah, a series of events. Of course, again, the spacecraft was extraordinarily sophisticated. North American Aviation won the contract in 1961, and I go in the detail in the book about how that was done, and it was really a lot of underhanded, shady stuff. North American actually didn't win the evaluation. Another company did, but things were maneuvered around so they would get the contract. And they were in charge of building it, and there was just a lot of problems with that particular spacecraft, the original one that they were working on. A lot of astronauts called it a disaster. Several of them called it a bucket of bolts. One astronaut said, this thing's not even going to get in Earth orbit, much less go to the moon. Just all kind of problems. They had wiring problems. They had problems with what was known as the environmental control system. Inside that spacecraft, you got a lot of machines and wires and electricity and things like that. So you got to be able to cool it down. And that's what the environmental control system did. They were all kind of problems with that. They were constantly having to replace it. They took it out so many times and sent it to the manufacturer. Hey, rebuild it. It was leaking glycol, which was kind of like antifreeze in your car to keep the systems cool and keep the cabin cool. And taking it in and out, likely scuffed wires. When they were doing the test, there were wiring and wires on the ground of the spacecraft that weren't covered. They weren't any type of conduit or anything. And they think that, again, they didn't know really, they never said what caused the fire because it completely burned out the inside of the spacecraft. I mean, the temperature got to 1,200 degrees. I mean, it destroyed everything, melted the crew couches that they were sitting on. There's almost no way to know. What they think likely happened, one of these wires got frayed, got scuffed, and it sparked. And that's all you need. Now, again, they delivered the spacecraft to the Cape in August of 1966, and NASA issued a certificate of worthiness saying it was ready to go. But there was a list of over 130 things that needed to be fixed, and they were fixing each and every one of them. But unfortunately, again, all it takes is one little thing to go wrong, and that's what happened in this particular situation. And of course, it was disastrous.
In the end, was there a person who was held responsible? Was the company held responsible? How did that play out?
Well, there was obviously investigations immediately, and there was a little bit of a stink because NASA wanted to investigate it itself. Put together a review board of experts and one astronaut to do it. And Jim Webb was the NASA administrator. He went to Lyndon Johnson pretty quickly in the United States and met with him. He'd like to look at it ourselves. And he was worried about some sort of an independent commission getting involved and dragging it out. And of course, you think, well, you're investigating yourself. What are you going to come up with? But the astronaut they picked to go on the review board was a pretty tenacious, no-nonsense guy named Frank Borman. And they didn't sweep anything under the rug. They said, NASA's to blame as well as North American Aviation. North American Aviation, of course, has a lot of shoddy and sloppy work. They brought the burned out spacecraft into a hangar and they completely disassembled it, took it apart piece by piece to try to find out what went wrong. And when they took one of the panels down from the wall, they found a socket wrench that had been left inside the spacecraft. That's like going and getting surgery and somebody leaving a scalpel inside of you something. I mean, and of course, Congress just hit the roof when they saw things like that. And of course, NASA's report, and I've read it, it's pretty thick, laid the blame exactly where it needed to be laid as far as NASA was concerned. Having a deadline like that, pushing so hard like that, coming up with, pushing the contractors and the subcontractors to get things done on a timely basis. But of course, North American Aviation, they're the ones that built it. When you build build a machine that kills people, I mean, you're responsible for it. So there was enough blame to go around. North American Aviation lost some money. They were fined. The families actually the Grissom family filed a lawsuit against North American Aviation, and they settled it out of court, and they paid all the families, and what today's money would be several $1 million apiece. So there was blame, and not one single person was targeted. Joe Shea was the head of the NASA program, the Apollo program in Houston. He was reassigned. But nobody really was, nobody walked the plank on it. There was enough blame to go around.
How much of the components and the design of Apollo 1 was reconfigured going into future Apollo missions? Was this a situation where the entire technology was scrapped, or did they use what they had and really try to perfect it for future missions?
Exactly. The basic design was the same. And I interviewed one engineer who was actually part of the redesign team and helped redesign the entire spacecraft. And so the general concept's the same. It doesn't really look all that different, but it was the astronauts would tell you the difference between the two spacecraft, under the skin, if you will, was night and day. They said that, they went from a bucket bolts to a magnificent flying machine. But that's the point I make in the book. That's why I call the subtitles "The Tragedy That Put Us on the Moon." Without the fire, we wouldn't have known all the problems that were in secret, within that spacecraft. The fire revealed everything. If we had tried to fly that, there was a disaster coming down the road. It was going to be a disaster somewhere. If it hadn't been that fire, we likely would have lost a crew in space. Several of the astronauts said that later. So we would, and if we had continued to fly it, there might have been 2 or 3 disasters. We definitely wouldn't have made Kennedy's deadline without the redesign. And my position is we might not have made it at all, because you realize, most people don't realize this, there was considerable opposition in the country to what we were doing. The costs involved. People think, the whole country rallied around NASA. Well, everybody was excited when we landed on the moon. But before that, public opinion polls, there's a large segment of people that didn't want to do it, thought it was a waste of money. We ought to be putting it in schools and cleaning up the slums and that kind of thing. Social programs, a lot of liberals in Congress were not in favor of it. So there's opposition. And after the fire, that opposition actually rose to a majority. There was a poll in July of 1967 that showed that 54% of Americans thought the cost was too high in terms of money. And now that we've lost 3 guys, why are we doing this? So losing a crew in space rather than on the ground would have been enough to finish it off. Again, that's speculation, but with the public opinion polls, of course, I think what saved NASA was the fact that there were so many other problems in the 1960s, right? Vietnam's going on, it's getting worse every day, and people's attention span went somewhere else. And it gave NASA time, because they closed the program for almost 2 full years while they did this. It kind of faded out of the limelight, and people were concerned about other things. And they went to work. They said, we're gonna continue this on. We're not gonna have these guys die in vain, because all 3 of them had said the same thing in interviews before the test. Hey, if we die, that's just part of it. This is our business, Roger Chaffee said. We're test pilots. This is what we're doing. And these are brave men to do things like that. We're very fortunate to have had them. So they wanted it to continue, and NASA wanted it to continue as well. So they just rolled up their sleeves, went to work, and moved it forward.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Was there ever any danger or possibility? You said how much that the sentiment in Congress and amongst the people had started to shift against the space program. Was there ever any time where they were saying, we're going to scrap this whole idea of NASA and just move on from it?
Oh yeah, because NASA was doing its own investigation, as I said, but of course Congress, they're going to get their licks in, because the way they looked at, hey, we are appropriating the money and we have a right to oversee it, and they do. And so there were hearings, the Senate particularly, and there was a lot of opposition. One of the main antagonists on the Senate committee investigating the Apollo 1 tragedy was a senator who died just, I think, a month or so ago, and that was Walter Mondale. He was the main one that was out after NASA. Now, they had a lot of friends on these committees, and the House had hearings as well, but it was mainly the Senate. And of course, what Walter Mondale looked into and he found out was that NASA realized North American aviation was not doing a very good job. Now, North American aviation had the contract for the spacecraft, the service module and the command module, but they also had the contract for the second stage of the Saturn V moon rocket. So they had a big chunk of NASA's budget. And you got to remember, NASA's budget was about $5 billion a year. Now think about that. That's 5% of the federal budget at the time. If that was the case today, NASA would get a budget of about $300 billion. Of course, today it's about 23. They don't get very much, but that's a big chunk of the federal pie. So obviously Congress wants to look into it. And of course, what they found out was NASA was troubled by what North American aviation was doing. They were troubled by cost overruns and sloppy work. And so they sent General Phillips, he was the head of the Apollo program in Washington, down in California to North American aviation to find out what was going on. He put together what he called a tiger team to go look at it. And he issued this scathing report. It's kind of an internal report where he kind of blasted North American aviation and said, you guys are not towing the line here. This is, you got to get going. This is some bad work, and this is what needs to be done. And of course, they were working to get it all done. Don't get me wrong. But by the time the fire, and then we had the investigations in the Senate hearings, Walter Mondale found out about that Phillips report, and he brought it up to NASA officials in the middle of this hearing, and they were not prepared for it at all. They were caught off guard that he knew about it. And they kind of said, well, you're hiding things from us. But I think in NASA's defense, it wasn't really a report. It was just a set of notes that Phillips had come up with and said, this is what needs to be fixed. Because if they had turned that over to Congress, they'd immediately politicized it. And if you're a contractor, that's the last thing you want to do. So there was some fireworks in those hearings over the Phillips report and over the awarding of the contract to North American Aviation.
But you think that by NASA kind of going to ground and keeping their head below the radar, they were able to plow forward to fix these problems the right way so that later missions would be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. They did a phenomenal job. Again, like I said, I interviewed an engineer that was on that design team. He talked about how hard they worked after the fire to rebuild that spacecraft. I mean, it's 25 hours a day, 8 days a week that they worked around the clock. And the spacecraft built was phenomenal. I mean, it flew to the moon 9 times. We had 9 moon missions. And really the only problem we had was Apollo 13. That was really the only, there was some few minor things, but Apollo 13 obviously was the closest thing to it is that we nearly lost that crew, and that was just a wire inside an oxygen tank. But when you've got things this sophisticated, and that's what people need to understand, this is a dangerous thing, even today, space travel. And we've had the Challenger disaster in Colombia. You're going to have disasters, and we've learned a lot with these tragedies. Apollo 1 taught us a lot. Not only did they redesign the spacecraft, it is a lot safer. There were safety features that they began putting in place in these spacecraft and on the launch towers and stuff that weren't there. So it made space travel a lot safer. Again, it's still dangerous, but it was safer. For example, there wasn't any type of fire suppression or fire extinguisher inside the cabin when the fire broke out. We learned not to put 100% oxygen inside a spacecraft under pressure like that. 100% oxygen under pressure is a bomb. There was, of course, the pressure rose considerably inside the spacecraft during the fire, and there was no valve they could turn to let the pressure out. And when the pressure's like that, because that inward hatch opened to the inside, with pressure like that, there's no way to open it. And one of the stories I talk about, I think is really interesting, is that in the original Mercury program, there was explosive bolts on the hatch. All you had to do was hit a button, and it would ignite the explosive devices and blow the hatch out. And it's ironic because it was Gus Grissom's Mercury mission in 1961. After splashdown, the hatch prematurely blew. The explosive bolts blew the hatch out, and the spacecraft filled with water and sank to the bottom. And of course, he went through a lot of questions, and people thought, well, did he panic? And actually, did he do that? That's why I don't like the movie The Right Stuff, because it portrays Gus as being this guy who panicked and maybe caused the accident. But he didn't. I proved pretty conclusively that he didn't blow the hatch. It was a design flaw. So what did they do? They took the explosive bolts out of the hatches, because they said, if we're in space and the hatch blows out, we're going to lose the crew. So they had this very complex hatch that took several minutes to open. So those guys were literally trapped in this inferno. They couldn't get out. So all of that stuff was changed. All of that, the hatch that they came up with wasn't explosive bolts, but you could get it open in 3 seconds. So there were ways to prevent that from ever happening again. So that's important, I think, to remember and understand.
Do you think that the lessons learned are the people today learning lessons from Apollo to apply to maybe going back to the moon and even Mars, that there's a lot of danger involved, but that it's something that has been done?
Oh yeah, no question about it. You'll never see 100% oxygen in a spacecraft again, ever. You got to remember, in those days, we didn't know a lot about things. We thought that you had to breathe 100% oxygen in space because astronauts would get the bends. But today, I think the International Space Station is about an 80-20 mix. There's some nitrogen in it too. We've learned so much about it, but yeah, there's a lot of things that they've learned. And people ask me that all the time about SpaceX and Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company. I said, I guarantee you that they've got Apollo 1 in mind. There's no question they do. You're never going to do those things again. The materials they use are non-flammable. Again, the atmosphere is going to be right. It's not going to be 100% oxygen under that kind of pressure anymore. The safety features that they've put in after Apollo 1, I guarantee you, are being put in place for NASA and for these commercial companies.
Do you think that the modern NASA and the modern SpaceX and these other companies and just the population in general, do we have the risk tolerance to watch that? It is possible that entire crews could die on the launch pad even before they get to the moon or into space.
Yeah, I wonder about that, because you got to remember, in Apollo, we had Kennedy's deadline and everybody was wanting to get that accomplished, but we were in the context of the Cold War. We thought we had a pretty fierce competitor in the Soviet Union, that the Soviets were poised. We can't let the Soviets land on the moon. We can't have a red moon. I mean, it was this national effort. Again, there's a lot of opposition to it, but there's also a lot of support. So it's kind of interesting today because we don't really have that. We don't have that drive, I don't think. And I would worry that if a crew was lost, that the whole thing might be shut down today. I think you're right. I don't know that we have that kind of tolerance. That remains to be seen. It seems like what SpaceX and others are doing are very good. I'm actually happy about it. I think I'm interested to see it continue, but people need to understand there's risk when you're in a spacecraft on top of a rocket filled with millions of pounds of high explosives. There's always going to be a risk. All it takes is one thing to go wrong in a machine with millions of moving parts. I mean, one thing goes wrong, one thing that we're not thinking of. It's like Challenger. Look at Challenger. We launched Challenger that day. Nobody ever thought there was a problem that the temperature had gotten below freezing and there was ice on the pad and that the O-rings of the solid rocket boosters would fail. I mean, nobody thought that. And nobody with Apollo 1. 100% oxygen, and NASA had been warned several times, hey, you got a potential bomb, but nobody ever thought we would have an ignition source inside the spacecraft. It just didn't come up. It's not going to be a spark. Well, again, all it took was one wire to get frayed, and that was, end of the story. So people need to understand there's risks.
In this podcast, Beyond the Big Screen, we like to look at what's the real background and context in movies and media, and you've definitely shown that. And I've found that watching other forms of media, like such as you brought up with Gus Grissom and the Right Stuff and Apollo 11, or Apollo 13 rather, the film, they seem to skim over this whole episode. They might even not even mention it. Why do you think that this hasn't caught more of the popular imagination? Because it sounds like it was a disaster that turned into a success story, but it seems to have just been more or less forgotten.
Yeah, the movie Apollo 13, they briefly mention it in the beginning. And with the Right Stuff, the 1983 film, The Right Stuff, it had one slight mention at the end when they were showing the actor that plays Gus Grissom, and they said that he was killed in the Apollo 1 fire. But I think the best media portrayal of it was the Neil Armstrong biopic, First Man. They do cover it in that. They actually show the guys in the spacecraft and the fire breaking out, and of course how the other astronauts dealt with it. And of course there's a series based on a book called The Astronaut Wives Club, and they have an episode about how Betty Grissom and the wives dealt with it. And that's about in the book. I talk about the wives and what the wives had to go through, and all the astronaut wives. They were, one astronaut said they all to be in history books, and I think that's true. And each one of these guys had small children. I mean, you think about that. They had to be told, "Hey, your daddy's never coming back home." So I think part of it is it's just gotten lost. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I said, this is going to get lost. And I talked to people about writing it, and I had a lot of people that were alive and of age at the time that didn't really remember Apollo 1, or they kind of sort of remembered something about it. And I said, we're going to lose this, because there's not been really a feature film about it. Of course, the Tom Hanks film that he did, the series of films back in I believe in 1998, From the Earth to the Moon. There's an episode on Apollo 1, but most people probably have not seen that. It's over 20 years old. And I found doing the research, not a lot of astronauts want to talk about it. Some of them didn't even mention it in their memoirs, or they said, "I'm not going to talk about that." It's still kind of tough for them to talk about.
Do you have any other maybe overlooked pieces of history and stories, either from this episode or from other episodes in history, that have really grabbed you?
One piece of this that grabbed me, and when I got into the process of writing the book, doing the research, I really didn't think I would be getting very much into the political side of things. And I talk about politics throughout the book. So some people might be thinking, well, I'm not really interested in the space program, but there's other aspects of this book, the political aspects of it. For example, why do we have mission control in Houston when all of the launch operations are in Florida? Why is it so far away? Well, I talk about why it's in Houston and the politics behind it, but there's a lot of politics. I have a whole chapter on the politics of awarding that contract to North American Aviation, how they got it. And we like to joke around and say, well, this is a complex machine built by the lowest bidder. Well, that's not how government contracts are awarded. I mean, it might be for potholes, but it's not for something like this. They evaluate all these companies with an evaluation board of technicians and engineers and people that know what they're talking about. And companies submit bids and proposals, and they evaluate them. They give them a score. Well, North American Aviation finished second in the running to Martin Marietta, which is now Lockheed Martin, and Martin should have got the contract. Martin thought they had it. But then Jim Webb and other officials at NASA asked that those scores be reevaluated based upon a company's experience with experimental aircraft, which boosted North American Aviation because they built the X-15 rocket. NASA had flown to the edge of space. Neil Armstrong was actually one of their civilian test pilots flying the X-15. So that boosted North American up. And that came up in the hearings. And of course, I dig into the background of why that was the case. Senator Robert Kerr was the chairman of the Senate Space Committee. He was a rich oil man from Oklahoma. And he had already met with North American Aviation officials and said, hey, if I get you this contract, what can you do for me? What can you do for Oklahoma? And of course, North American said, well, we'll build a plant here and we'll hire a bunch of people and that kind of thing. And so he pushed to do that. Well, the interesting part of it is Jim Webb, who was NASA's administrator appointed by Kennedy, guess who he was? He was an oil executive in Robert Kerr's oil company. That's where he came from. So there's a connection there. So Kerr wanted North American to get it. Jim Webb said we need to reevaluate it. And a lot of people around NASA was saying, hey, North Americans got it in the bag. Why are we going through all this rigmarole to do this evaluation? We know who's going to get the contract, and that's who got the contract. So that kind of stuff came out, and I didn't expect all of that. And there are other things involved in the book, a lot of things with money and banking. For example, when North American wanted to do their banking in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they put all their money in a bank that Robert Kerr and Jim Webb had stock in. I mean,
wow.
It's just a lot of that kind of stuff that's in it that I didn't really anticipate getting into. I thought, gosh, look at this rabbit hole I'm about to go down. So I even make the statement that politics killed Gus, Ed, and Roger, because Martin should have got the contract. And if Martin gets the contract, that's not to say there wouldn't have been a disaster, but that disaster wouldn't happen. And there's even some astronauts who said the same thing that in their memoirs later on, said that just always puzzled them how that came about. And they always wondered what would have happened if Martin would have got it instead of North American Aviation. So that's a big piece of it. That's actually my favorite chapter in the book.
But in the long run, did any of that political wrangling, did that seep into the public, and did it have any sort of negative impact on the company North American?
Oh yeah, and I think, of course, and there were reporters at the time, journalists that looked into it. And it was reported at the time, some of these things. Even the New York Times had some of this stuff, and some of it came out in the hearings. Because Jim Webb was asked by one senator, did North American finish first in the rankings? And he said, oh, yeah, that was our preferred company. And of course, they went on about their questioning. Well, a few weeks later, the Senate learned that was not the case. They called Webb back to the Senate and said, would you like to revise that statement, sir? And he did. He had to say, well, no, it wasn't the first company that was chosen. So yeah, it did come out. And North American took a little bit of a beating, but at the time, normally you might say, well, we'll just give the contract to somebody else. That probably would have happened in the normal circumstances. But you got to remember, we still have the deadline in 1960. There's no way that contract can be awarded to somebody else to start over. And we'd already spent billions of dollars. So the idea was fix the problem. This has been a disaster, but fix the problem.
Yeah, I think that's the great part of this book, is that it shows like that deadline looming over everything, and that was really what it gave them a motivator to not just say, all right, that's that, let's get it fixed.
Had to if you're going to make that deadline. And that meant everything. Everything was based on that deadline of getting it done by then. And of course, Kennedy was assassinated. He was martyred. We didn't want to let him down. And of course, we're still thinking in the back of our mind that the Soviets are poised to go to the moon, and they were constantly, there were reports coming in all the time that they're building this giant moon rocket, and that's what they're training for. So we had that going as well. We can't get to the end of the line and lose in the bottom of the ninth inning. So things were certainly motivators. And if we hadn't had that, though, and there's one astronaut that said this, he said, if Kennedy hadn't gave us that deadline, he said, we'd still be horsing around trying to get to the moon. There wouldn't have been any push behind.
Before we go, can you maybe tell us where we can find out more about your book and some of your other projects?
Sure. I have a little website, ryanswalters.net, where I have my books up there, and people can contact me on Facebook, Twitter. That's up there. You can send me my personal emails on my website. You can find the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's actually in Barnes & Noble stores. So anybody is free to contact me any way they want to contact me about anything they want to talk about. I'm pretty open guy.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. Of course, a big thanks goes out to Ryan S. Walters, author of the book Apollo 1, Tragedy That Put Us on the Moon. Links to learn more about Ryan and his book and many other books can be found at his website, ryanswalters.net, or in the show notes. I would also just like to quickly mention a great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me know what you think about the show and help others learn about Beyond the Big Screen. If you'd like to follow us on social media, all you have to do is search for A2Z History Page on Facebook and Twitter primarily. There could be more coming, but those are the main ones. You can also send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to talk about movies, potential guests, potential topics, or any sort of feedback or questions or comments about the show. All of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I will see you next time, Beyond the Big Screen.